Thank you all for presenting. Those were all very compelling presentations. I have one in particular for the ISO presentation in asking, because you, Mark, of
There
course.
you are. Sorry, can't tell you're coming from. Hi.
You sit on the ISO board, yes, for helping contribute to the conversation about the ISO standards.
It's called work group, yeah.
Right. So I have a kind of a two-part question. Who sits on that council to help decide those? Because that is an agency, not necessarily the certification agencies deciding kind of the governing rules for divers, just in looking closer at the expertise that's being driven in that. I'm glad you are on it, but I'm just curious as to what that process is and how all of the training agencies are aware of and learn about the new ISO changes that can happen over time. You did mention also that it can take 5 years for a change to happen. So how quickly or often are we seeing standard changes in, say, our open water diver classes?
Okay. The work group which designs and negotiates these standards has got representatives from around the world and lots of different training organizations represented. Mark, for example, comes along to many of these meetings. And you get people there who represent different federations from around the world, different training organizations, and also other interested bodies. For example, you might get the equivalent of what we call the executive in this country, in the UK, sorry. So they all come together and negotiate it. It does take a long time. Once the standards are out, as I say, it's typically every 5 years to make any revisions. And in fact, that's proven to work well, because surprisingly, I mean, some people say, well, we haven't changed this particular course in X amount of years, why not? Well, for the same reason, we haven't changed the fact that you've got brake lights on the back of cars. Lights on the back of the cars pretty well. It's helped safety a lot. And it would be probably unwise to say, well, we've had brake lights on the back of cars for decades now, let's take them off and try something different. Proven system, it works. And the actual protocols for teaching someone how to dive and the skills involved don't change very rapidly. Apart from the most cutting edge courses like the rebreather courses, training someone to use open circuit is a long established and well understood process. Usually, if there are concerns, they're the kind of things which we've heard about today. They're not a fault in the training standards or the courses, it's how they're being implemented by a specific instructor. So I would say the system is good, it's representative from around the world, all different training organizations. It creates good standards, and although they can only be changed every 5 years, that seems to work pretty well. We haven't had a problem with that so far. And to answer the last part of your question, I believe, how do the training organizations find out? Some of them are involved directly, so they find out that way. Otherwise, it's disseminated to them through bodies like the Recreational Scuba Training Council and all their members, CMAS, because they're involved, and things like the Rebreather Training Council. So the pan-industry bodies tend to filter down news about these new standards as they're created. Any more?
Hello, I have a question for each one of the marks, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, I'll get to you later, Gareth. Regarding the new ISO standards or the ISO standards that are in development for rebreather divers and rebreather instructors, how do you see that impacting existing certifications? Is that something that would be retroactively applied? Would the existing certifications for divers and instructors be grandfathered into the new ISO standards? How do you see all falling through?
Want to take a slide?
Go ahead, go first.
They're not retrospective. In other words, if the new standard said one of the things you've got to be able to do is to clear your mask while wearing a top hat, you don't have to go back to everybody else and make them do that. However, if you say, okay, the new rebreather standards have got instructor level X, and the training agencies have got instructors at a level X. Even though they may make slight incremental changes, they can all say that from now on, they can be considered to be equating to this level. Unless it's a dramatically different program, they'll be able to match it up. And anybody who's an instructor at that level in, and by the way, I think I'm talking to the right person, you can't tell from up here. Yeah, they would be able to effectively get that credential on their card.
So it would be basically grandfathered in.
In a respect, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
The only caveat I would put on that is that provided that the course that you did meets the requirements of the new course, and that won't always be the case. There will be some agencies that will need to meet their standards to come up to the ISO standard. One of the, and I was quite critical of standards in my presentation. One of the reasons is that, quite frankly, they've been the lowest common denominator in the past. I don't think that was the case with the rebreather standard. There were cases where almost all agencies agreed to lift something to meet the new standard, which I think was frankly, that was exactly what I wanted to achieve by going into these meetings, is to raise the standard rather than drop it to the lowest common denominator. So if the agency previously met those standards, yes, you could grandfather them. If your previous qualification wouldn't have met it, then no, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Let's understand. And then I did have a question for you, Mark. I understand when you're clearly talking about standards and how they basically become the lowest common denominator. But then how do you deal with the other end of the equation where you have instructors that may be creating their own standards by which they're going to judge the qualification of a student for certification that may or may not have any basis in fact or logic? It's just, this is part of what they feel they want to do, whether it's from an ego perspective or for whatever misguided motivation they have. I mean, how do you deal with that? Because it does exist. You have, I've seen it myself. You have instructors doing some amazing things, and you look at that and say, please explain to me what bearing that has on anything that you're trying to accomplish from a certification standpoint. And none of this exists. So, and then yet if you fail that or you don't meet to their satisfaction, oh, no, I can't certify you because you didn't meet the requirements.
So I think, and this is why the whole fast food versus Michelin thing set off the light bulb for me, because there are instructors and agencies that really go down that fast food model. We think the Michelin model, the Michelin Guide model, is a much better model, and that is it almost sums up the ethos within TDI and STI. We've got the standards, but we don't expect people to teach to those standards. We expect them to go beyond those standards. We expect them to introduce SMB deployment if that is a common thing in your area. We expect them to cover local procedures. So we expect there to be stuff over and above the standard. And the trouble is that it's much easier to evaluate a McDonald's than it is to evaluate a Michelin star restaurant, because you get into that, well, is that good or is that bad? If something's unique, is that because it's better than anything, or is it just invention for the sake of it? Our philosophy within TDI and STI is that there's sort of three things. There's the things in the standards that we say you must do, and you must do them. There's the things that we say you must not do, and you must not do them. And there's the stuff we don't say. So if you're adding stuff in, it's got to be consistent with that course. Okay, so for example, if you're teaching someone to use Trimix on an open water course because you think that anything deeper than 10 meters should be on Trimix, that's clearly not within the remit of an open water course. But there are gray areas in that that fall into that. You've then, if you are withholding certification because of something that you've put in rather than the agency, then we wouldn't support that. However, coming back to that, there are instructors that people will go to because they know they put X, Y, and Z in their courses. And, you know, their selling point is my courses are much further beyond. And if people are going to those instructors because they want to be tested at that level, that's a discussion between them.
No, I mean, I agree, a higher quality of education, you know, typically speaking, probably better than a lower quality of education. But then again, it's where do you draw, you know, how do you evaluate what's a higher quality of education versus something that's capricious just because this particular, like you said, I'm teaching an open water student to use trimix. Why? And then when they can't deal with that, it's, well, I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to certify you. And I don't know that the customer or the student knows enough to say, well, wait a minute, you're being unrealistic. I mean, so what recourses does that student have if they're in a situation like that? And again, I mean, there's, you know, you can't control everything, and I understand that, but I do know of situations where that has happened. So I'm not just trying to be, you know.
That has to be on a case-by-case basis. And that, you know, that's what our training department does. It says, well, you know, let's look at this and see what the situation actually is.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to salute Mr. Mark Powell, because I totally agree on what you just said. I think the same. We are both old people. That is why we both of us will be extincted very soon. Well, and you certainly know that that is a very good approach, like Japanese approach and so on. But it's certainly not the approach that is winning the war into diving industry. I also salute Mark, the other Mark. I don't know if you remember me. We have met several years ago. I was the representative of Portugal in WG30, in the first group that discussed the standards in Europe.
Yes, I do.
And I was chosen by the Portuguese Federation and by my club, which is the oldest diving school of Europe, still working. And I was not chosen to be a very expert diver. There are here a lot of divers better than me, but I was chosen because I speak English and I am a lawyer. So they sent the bloody lawyers to, everybody thought it was fantastic to go to Europe, but it was very hard work, staying 3 days closed in a hotel, discussing law. You, the English people, you brought a linguistic, and we were discussing if we should write should or you would, and that well, I was the only one who spoke all the languages in the room except the Greek, but I just pick up the microphone to answer them and to say to the other ones that for my scandal, I realized that we were fighting there a commercial fight in several ways. The first way is that I was instructor from Kmash, traditionals. We did courses for 1 month courses, traditional way. Of course, nothing is no longer like that. And when Paddy came, Paddy was very clever to engage Mr. Mark Caney, because he's known, he used to be a CMAS instructor also, and he's a very competent instructor. So they got the best of us in order to be more. But the fight was the following. It was, I remember that one of the big discussions were 4 students for in the standard, or 8. And until I was there, the standard stayed with 4. After that, we dropped the arms, and then you approve 8 students. You were able to drop the quality of the standard because it's suited. And the other thing is that there was a fight between countries. There were very nice people who organized and were leading the process, very competent ones from Austria and from Germany. And there were, as the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, also competent people. But the fight was, the commercial fight was the following. They wanted to, they had a problem. They had the winter and they could not dive. They didn't have the access to the sea for the open water. and they could not dive in the. And so they wanted to drop the standards of formation, of teaching. And on the opposite, they wanted to raise the standards for the country, for dive centers, for the countries that were receiving them. I don't want to be rude, but the general idea is that they wanted to do the courses during the winter without much training in open water, and they wanted us, the Portugal, France, Spain, to have the competence to accept, to receive and lead students that were not very well. Nevertheless, it was a very good approach, because the standard of quality is a minimum. We have to. It was better than nothing. The quality was dropping, and so in that moment we stopped that falling from to the end. And so that's why to place an answer the question. Otherwise, they will said that I just speak the microphone just to speak. What do you think will be the future of ISO standardization? Maybe now with your approach of Mr. Mark Powell, and still with the big competence of Mark Caney. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I use the car industry a lot in my analogies. All cars follow the same ISO standards, but there are some car manufacturers that distinguish themselves on quality, some on price, some on they can carry more people, some that can go faster. And I think that's the biggest lesson. It comes back to what JC was saying this morning. We don't all need to do the same thing. Okay, in the diving industry, I say, yeah, I'm the best and the cheapest. Well, you can't be both. Which are you? Are you trying to do the cheapest course? And there is a market for that. You know, the backpackers, the people who just want to try it, there's good business there. Great, do that. I want to train the highest quality. I want to bring in the people who are, you know, be committed divers. Well, in that case, charge more and advertise and position yourself for those people. So I think as an industry, we need to just do different things, except that one dive center may be doing cheap, cheerful, fast, quick courses. Great, I have no problem with that. And others may be aiming for the higher end, you know. So we can have the I'm going to insult nationalities here, I suppose, but you know, the BMW versus the Skoda type of dive centers or even agencies. So that would be my response. The standards can stay the same, and then the difference is how far above the standard is that agency or instructor.
And I'm just going to add something, because now I haven't spoken, is the difficulties. We humans are really simple. And so we just look at a standard and say, it's that, therefore everybody is the same. And so I appreciate that model of you raise and there's a different market, but the majority of people coming into the diving market don't know what they don't know. And they just go, you're all members of an ISO framework or the WRSTC or the Rebreather Training Council, therefore you are all the same. And that is a flawed mental model that's in existence. So I get what you're saying, Mark, but we humans are quite simple, and we'll just look for the same. Thank you. Right, I think we've got selfies now.
Yes.
There's another question.
Oh,
Sorry, I just wanted to know your thoughts about, because I heard a lot the word dive centers, and I would like to hear a little bit more of independent instructors. Because, for instance, in Portugal, an independent instructor cannot certify a person by law, but we know the same as an instructor in a dive center. So I would like to know your thoughts a little bit of independent instructors.
Do you want to go first?
If we're going back to the ISO standards, I mentioned there's a thing called a service provider. And normally that is a dive center, dive school, dive club. But in situations where an independent instructor can work alone, he becomes the service provider or she becomes the service provider. So whoever is, as it were, the body which is offering that training, whether it's an individual or a business or a club, they are the service provider and they have to fulfill all the requirements of that service provider's duties. Now, you do have many countries where independent instructors can't work. then that doesn't happen. Simple as that. And just to go back to a point that was made just now, it's very easy to find fault with the standards, but it's a bit like the police. When we're driving in our BMW, in Mark's case, I'm sure, Skoda in mine, I suppose, and you see a police car come up behind you, we all perhaps get a little bit nervous, we concentrate a bit more on our driving. And if the police come and tell you you shouldn't have a bonfire in your garden on a Sunday because it's annoying your neighbor, you think, police. But imagine a world without the police. It wouldn't become a very nice place very quickly. So standards are a good starting point. They are not the total solution, as we keep saying, they're your bases. And then it's a question of getting the right attitude into the people who will implement those standards so that you get the quality product you want.
Let's just build on that from a survey I did last year about the use of, or 2 years ago, about the use of checklists in rebreather diving instruction. And I asked instructors, did you use a checklist more in your own diving, in the instructional setting, or about the same? And unsurprisingly, more instructors use checklists in the instructional setting than they do in their own diving. So I asked the question, why was that the case? And so it was compliance, fear of litigation, and it was all about understanding, to your point, Mark, the police that are out there. Now, if an instructor stands up at the front of the class and says, I have to teach you a checklist because the standards say I have to teach you one, they don't have the attitude. And to me, it's about developing the attitude, not the compliance. And that's a difficulty bit. It's like, I met the standard, I taught you this, but the way it was delivered meant that it didn't have any value. And so when you go out and dive in the real world, checklists, you don't need those. And yet there is huge evidence that says checklists are there to trap errors, and they do trap errors. So it's this bit of, yes, the standards are there, but it's the attitude that goes with it. Because you are saying to people, I want to teach you about checklists because it stops me and my fallibility and errors propagating, as opposed to, I have to teach you the standard. I have to teach checklists because the standard says so. So it's about recognizing that human behavior that's there.
And you might think we got together in the bar last night and all agreed more or less what we were going to say. It just so happens we have the same attitude. And I think that's down to the fact we've all examined the industry, we've seen where the problems are, and we all desire that high quality diver training situation in the end. And so none of this should come as a complete shock. It all comes down to having a base point of here's what you've got to teach, and now having the attitude to do it really well.
Cool. And coming back to your specific question, within TDI, SDI standards, it says you must follow local regulations. So if it's illegal to be an independent instructor in Portugal, you can't do it. End of story, as exactly as Mark said. However, we support dive centers. We think dive centers are the core of the industry. But I also think there is a place for independent instructors. Some of the best instructors I know are independent instructors. Freelance instructors are a great resource for dive centers. So don't underestimate the value of independent instructors.
Yeah. My question is about safety and at the same time about the standards. So firstly, I would like to hear something from Gareth and after from both of you guys. So people nowadays, divers, we dive deeper and deeper, and especially in Cape diving, we do new records, and the curiosity push us to dive further and deeper. So first of all, there is no standards for that kind of diving, right? So it's a Michelin restaurant in the terminology of Mark. So first of all, we see the uncertainty about measuring the risk. So some, of course, when we dive plus 10, 20 meters, plus, I mean of the depth, plus 50 meters of penetration, and that way is the only proper way. And with every dive, we learn ourselves to dive deeper and deeper. But anyway, there are limits after which we have no idea what can happen. For example, 3 days ago or so, one of the famous and deepest divers in the world died in Italy. Probably you know about that, 335 meters. So the guy was great and did great stuff. But what about that uncertainty? Do you have some ideas how to manage that? Probably there is, I don't know, some system. And what about the standards? Okay, with recreational diving, everything is more or less clear. But really, I'm confused about the standards, rebreather diving, blah, 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 blah. So for me, honestly, it's more about for what the instructor will be jailed if something will be wrong on his course, you know?
Your mic's failed now. So the first bit about safety and risk and uncertainty. So that bit is about risk perception and what is acceptable to you. And the purpose of having training programs is to give you, as Mark sort of touched on, Am I a Diver with Ranulph Fiennes? It gives you a baseline to go beyond. It shouldn't be there as a, right, here's the next step, and card collecting. It's about building experience between those. One of the difficulties with a training setup is that you want to get your students to pass the class because that's good from a business point of view. But success is a terrible teacher when you never get it wrong. You have to have failures as you go along and build that. And that's, in the aviation sector, it's about running simulations. And I was chatting with Antti at lunchtime. You want to run simulations that are difficult, aviation simulations. You want to have simulations that are difficult and you fail. And then you debrief and you can learn from that. So it's about creating an environment where people can go out, explore the boundaries, eat away a little bit, but understand that they are close to a margin that they have never, that they don't know what it is. How do they fail safely? So if I have a catastrophic gas failure now, where's my buddy? How do I manage that? Do I have the reserves? What's the contingencies? Have I validated that process? And that's, that's outside of the traditional training, but that's about training to teach students how to pass a class, not necessarily how to teach out the diving in the real world. How do standards help that? My view of standards is it's there for a baseline. It's great. The bit that I don't know if it's in the standards is how do you do the quality checking of those standards? So to your point about independent instructors working at dive centers or on their own, how do you go and do the check to make sure that the instruction that is delivered lines with the agency standards which have already been matched? So you're going to go and do your instructor development class. ISO is going to audit that. But then it's a case of, right, that's you tick MOT. Now, where's your consistency of your checking? And to me, that's the bit that is missing from the industry, not ISO, agency, dive center. It's where's the standards check that goes out there? And a tick chase of tick, tick, tick QC form that goes back does not assess performance. So that's my soapbox.
And I think, in the area that you're talking about, cave diving, there's certain levels in cave diving that could be standardized and actually are standardized. Exploratory dives should never be standardized.
Totally agree.
The people who are making the mistakes that we will learn from shouldn't be standardized. You can't standardize something that we haven't yet learned the lessons from. So, I go back to Sheikh Exley's Blueprint for Survival. Okay, that was the first cave diving standard, if you like. And where did that come from? It came from accident analysis. We used to be really good at accident analysis in the diving industry. We look at, well, there's all these deaths. Why? What do we need to do to put in place? And that's all a standard is really. So, it should never get to the ISO standard level unless there is a good level of standardization already in the industry. We've all agreed that, yes, that is a good idea, or no, that's not a good idea. So, yeah, I don't think exploratory cave dives will ever be, there'll never be an ISO standard for exploratory cave dives.